It is great to be back in Hong Kong and to see so many of my good friends and colleagues. I've been very fortunate to visit this fantastic institute many times over the last 20 years, and to see it grow, and now you have these magnificent new facilities. It's just great to see the investment by Hong Kong in sport. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about my ideas and opinions of strength and conditioning and where we possibly need to go. I still see enormous deficiencies in a large number of strength and conditioning programs throughout the world, both at the amateur, the national, and even at the highest professional level. And this is not so much a criticism, it's more a reflection on how much this field has advanced and how much new knowledge is actually coming out daily around our understanding of the human and how it responds to training. I want to start off by reiterating how important strength is for our athletes. In fact, all of our athletes. There is not a single athlete in any sport that will not benefit from strength training. The amount of emphasis, of course, changes depending on the sport and their level of competition. The reason why is that strength is such an underlying quality for so many other aspects of performance, in particular for power. And if we have a look here at these particular graphs, we see the relationship, for example, between power output during a jump squat here and 40-meter sprint time. You see a very close relationship there. Again here, jump squat power and 10-meter sprint time, and even 5-meter sprint time, strong correlation. So there is an underlying relationship between neuromuscular power and sprinting performance, both over short and longer distances. There is also a very strong relationship between the strength of the athlete and their power capacity. And this is data compiled from a whole series of studies over several decades. And we see the relationship between squat strength, this is maximal squat expressed as body weights, and maximal power produced in a jump squat. And you see a very strong relationship, 0.644, between those two performance qualities. So strength underlies power. The reason for this comes down to basic physiology. These graphs were produced by Fenn and Hill and others back in the 30s and of last century. And what we see is the relationship between velocity and power and force for the neuromuscular system. And this relationship holds true whether you're looking at a single muscle fiber, a whole muscle, or even multi-joint movements such as squat or bench press. And we see that as the velocity of movement increases, the amount of force that can be exerted decreases. The combination of velocity and force gives us the power output, and we see this relationship where power output is peaking around 30% of their maximum force capability of the muscle. Now what we see is that if you increase the force capacity of the muscle, say by 40%, then of course this shifts the force velocity curve, and that results in a shift in the power curve as well. And we see a considerable increase in maximal power output, but also power output across all velocities and all forces. So a very close, intimate relationship exists between strength and power. So let's turn our attention to some actual training studies. This was a very nice study published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning last year by Paul Comfort's group, relating the changes in squat strength to sprinting performance. I want to try and demonstrate how intimate strength is, the relationship to a whole range of actual very critical performance characteristics for the athlete. These athletes undertook strength and power training, but no sprint training. The purpose was to determine how changes in underlying strength and power might affect sprint speed. So these athletes were already fairly well developed, although their relative strength at 1.78 body weights was not fantastic, but they were able to increase that over the course of the pre-season to over 2 body weights without much of a change in body mass here. And you can see the changes in squat strength from 170 up to 200 kilos. And these are the results, which I think are quite important for us to come back And you'll note in my paper that I wrote for the proceedings that in many ways we need to come back to the basics. I think that in many programs we're, I guess, starry-eyed by so many new techniques and new technologies coming on board, and we're grasping onto those as the holy grail, the magic bullet that's going to turn our athletes around. And we're losing sight of the underlying physiological and biomechanical bases of how an athlete performs better. We see here from Comfort's group, this is time along here to complete 5, 10 and 20 metres in a sprint. And through purely strength training, increasing that squat strength to body weight ratio from about 1.78 up to 2 body weights, we see significant improvement at all distances, 5, 10 and 20 metres there, in as little as 8 weeks. Now, my colleagues and I have completed a number of studies to try and delve into the relationship between strength and power and how we should actually train different levels of athlete. We published a series of papers in Medicine, Science in Sports and Exercise. These research studies was led by my PhD student, now a colleague at ECU, Dr. Prue Cormie, and Professor Mike McGuigan, now at Auckland University of Technology. And please, if you're interested in any of these papers, please contact me and I'll email them out to you. So this is the underlying research design, where we had groups of athletes. These were people who were recreationally trained, they weren't elite, and training at different levels. But we have a stronger group here. Their average squat strength was 1.97 body weights. A weaker group here, 1.32 body weights in the back squat. Both these groups doing power training. And then a weaker group, 1.28 body weights in the back squat doing strength training. We trained them using strength training only. And then we had a control group here as well. So the power training consisted of 5 weeks training, mid-test, and then 5 weeks, and then post-testing. The strength training, same pattern. So the first question is, if we are to have our athletes coming in and we deem them to be not strong, then what should we do? Should we launch into some power training? Should we have them doing Olympic lifts, power cleans, etc., hang cleans? Or should we get them strong first? I mean, this is an important question. I still see many very high-level sports performance programs which are throwing their athletes straight into plyometrics and Olympic lifting methodologies. But is that the best way to go? So we teased out the data to have a look at strength training here. These are in relatively weaker subjects. You can see their squat strengths here in terms of body weights. One group did strength training, the other group did power training, which was basically jump squats with body weight and with a 30% load here. You can see the training protocol here, 3 times per week for 10 weeks. This is the strength training protocol, and then the power training. So let's have a look at the initial results. Where we have a look at maximal power, this is change from baseline. This is in a jump squat movement. And we see that both strength training and power training will significantly increase at 5 and even at 10 weeks the power output of these athletes, whether they do strength or power training. Very similar improvements here. If we have a look at power increases across a range of loads from 0 up to 80% of 1 RM, we see also the same pattern. Both groups, both increase their power output, whether they do strength training in black here or the red bar which represents power training. And you see very similar increases. However, once we get up to the heaviest load of 80%, we see that the strength training seems to have a superior effect, but it was not significant statistically. If we turn our attention to an actual sport-related quality of sprint performance, we see similar improvements between strength and power training. It does look like this power training was superior, but it wasn't statistically. Here we see both groups improve their 40-metre sprint time, whether they do strength training or power training. Of course, if we look at maximal strength, we see very little improvement in the power training group, but we see significant improvement in the strength training group. They get much stronger, as you would expect. If we delve down into the mechanisms then and have a look at the changes here in the velocity versus force curve here, we see a shift This is for the, this group here is for strength training, and up the top is for power training. We see that most of the shifts are at the lower force level and the higher velocities, not much shift down here at the higher force low velocities. If we have a look at strength training though, we see a shift in the whole curve, particularly at the low velocities and high force end of the spectrum. So what are the mechanisms underlying this? We looked at the actual architecture of the muscle, and we see that vastus lateralis, for example, a significant increase in muscle thickness as measured by ultrasound in the strength training group, no change with power training. Lean muscle mass here as measured by DEXA, significant improvement for the strength training, no change for power training whatsoever. Maximal muscle activation, so measurement of EMG during a maximal isometric contraction, we see considerable neural adaptation in the strength training group where they're increasing the maximal activation of the quadriceps. There was a change here for the power training, but it didn't reach statistical significance. Interestingly, though, when we look at the rate of rise of muscle activation, in other words, how quickly can they ramp their muscles up, how quickly can they turn them on, we see no change in the strength training group, but a significant improvement in the power training group. Now, this is, of course, the highly specific nature of training and the neural adaptations that are associated with that. So, performance improvements were brought about through positive adaptations to the neuromuscular factors that affect power production, but these adaptations were highly specific to the training stimulus. Our conclusion from this study was that strength training is equally effective as power training at increasing power in relatively weak individuals. So the next question is, does underlying strength affect the ability to adapt to power training? Is the magnitude of performance improvement different, whether you are training stronger or weaker athletes? So, similar design to the previous study, we had stronger athletes and weaker athletes. You can see their relative back strength here, back squat strength. We have a look at the training sessions. Both groups did 3 sessions per week of 0 or body weight and 30% 1RM jump squats. They did no other lower body training. I emphasize that because the stronger subjects actually ceased any heavy resistance training during this period. So let's have a look at maximal power output during a bodyweight jump squat. We see that at baseline, the stronger group is not only stronger in back squat, but they also have higher maximal power output than the weaker group. Once again, underlying the relationship between strength and power. If we have a look then at the training intervention and we track them across the 10 weeks of training here, we see the changes, percentage change in, the change in watts per kg of maximal power output in a bodyweight jump squat. We see significant changes right across from 3 weeks onwards here, but you see a larger increase amongst the stronger athletes, particularly early. They seem to be able to adapt faster with greater improvements, and it's not until week 7 that we see similar improvements between the stronger and the weaker athletes. So at the mid-test we see, if you have a look at the effect size, 1.6 here versus 0.95, much greater effect in the stronger athletes than the weaker athletes. Then by 10 weeks post-test, we've got both are producing about an 18% improvement in between the two groups. So the stronger athletes appear to be able to adapt faster and with greater magnitude. Looking again to the mechanisms and how this is occurring, we see peak power against plotted here. The stronger athletes, you can see the changes here occurring at the lower speeds. And then the weaker athletes with their strength training, you can see a considerable shift right across the velocities. In terms of 40-metre sprint time, we see the stronger athletes and the weaker athletes produced a significant improvement. There's no difference between these two here. But we see for squat strength 1RM, significant improvement for the weaker group, which you'd expect. They're doing power training, they're relatively weak. Even if they do power training, they do get stronger. But the stronger group actually got weaker. Now, this is a very, very important take-home point. If you stop the strength training of already strong athletes, they will get weaker relatively quickly. And that will actually impede their ability to increase power and performance. That means that athletes must perform strength training throughout their season, as well as in the pre-season preparation, because they will lose strength and that will impact their power capability. The mechanisms here, once again, we looked at maximal muscle activation. We see an increase, although not significant, in the weaker group. We actually saw a decrease in maximal activation in the stronger group in as little as 5 weeks. Because we're no longer giving them the heavy resistance stimulus, their neural system adapts by reducing its ability to maximally activate the motor unit pool. Rate of rise of muscle activation here, one of the key underlying factors of rate of force development and power output, we see that both the stronger and weaker groups respond to power training with an increase in the ability to switch their muscles on rapidly. If we look at muscle thickness here, we see a slight increase in the weaker group, but actually a decrease in the stronger group. Again, in as little as 10 weeks, in the stronger individuals, with the removal of the maximal strength training stimulus, their muscles actually start to atrophy. Musculotendinous stiffness, here we see a considerable improvement in the stronger group compared to the weak group, and I'll come back to the mechanisms of that in a moment. These graphs look a little bit complex, so I'll just walk you through them. What they are is the actual power output in a counter movement bodyweight jump, and we see here the actual power output, and then this is normalized to time. So this is the total time it takes them to complete the repetition here. And we see the changes in the stronger and the weaker group here at baseline, mid-test and post-test in the dashed line. This is a similar plot, but it's force against velocity. So this is the eccentric phase here, because this is negative velocity. This is the concentric phase. And already you can see a marked difference in the adaptation between the stronger and the weaker individuals. A larger part of the adaptation to power training with stronger individuals is a change in the eccentric phase, in the way in which they manage the eccentric load and then use that to generate greater concentric force. You can see a marked increase here in the concentric force compared to the weaker group here. That's initiation of the counter movement, eccentric, concentric, and then this point here is takeoff. That's outlining the eccentric and concentric phase. So you can see the changes here, fairly similar when we look at power against normalized time, but where we see the real changes is here, where we see in the eccentric phase the increase in force output that they can produce at a given eccentric velocity, an increase in the actual velocity of descent. So this movement from baseline here to post indicates that they're actually dropping into the jump faster compared to the weaker group here. They produce a decrease, but nowhere near the same speed. These are the increases here in force output at various velocities during the eccentric and concentric phase, quite marked for the stronger group, less so for the weaker group. And in fact, if we were to overlay the stronger group, this is what they would look like. So it definitely indicates that weaker individuals are not as able to adapt to power training to produce the same improvement in performance. Our conclusion was that stronger athletes are better able to utilize the eccentric phase to generate very, very powerful movements. The mechanisms for this, they have increased unloading. In other words, they drop into the jump in this case much faster because they're strong enough to be able to tolerate the very high stretch loads that they generate. The weaker group are not. They generate greater eccentric velocity by that mechanism. They have increased stiffness. This means that their eccentric force and rate of force development in the stronger group is much higher, and they have a greater ability to translate this momentum into force production, and this results in increased power output. Now, of course, there's a whole range of mechanisms involved in what's called the stretch shortening cycle. I won't go into detail with that, but there's likely to be changes in terms of they have greater preload, For the stronger group, greater ability to utilize the interaction of the contractile and elastic elements here. The stretch reflex also is probably facilitating, and there is also probably greater disinhibition of the Golgi tendon organ reflex as well. So, a key point is that stronger athletes have an increased ability to adapt to power training. They have a tendency towards greater and faster improvement. So the take-home message is, if your athletes are relatively weak, you need to focus on the basics, get them strong first, before moving on to more sophisticated power type training.